We will turn to Byzantium with Sophie Moore. So it's really a great pleasure to introduce our second panelist for this morning, Dr. Sophie Moore of Newcastle University. Dr. Moore is a Byzantine archaeologist and an expert on archaeological theory. Her research applies phenomenological approaches to material culture to interpret embodied human experience in past societies. Dr. Moore also has compared archaeological data sets to textual sources to investigate lived moments in the Byzantine world, such as singing in church, shrouding the dead, or viewing an icon. She is a member of the Torch Network, an interdisciplinary consortium of Byzantinists who challenge standard narratives of Byzantine history. Dr. Moore is also a member of the Sigalasis Fieldwork Project in Southwest Turkey, where she is analyzing courseware ceramics to investigate transformations in urban landscapes during the 7th and 8th century of the current era. Dr. Moore's talk is entitled Byzantine Bread Stamps, Imprint, Immateriality, and the Sacred Through the Ontological Turn. Thank you very much, Sophie.
Thanks for that lovely introduction. I'm not sure that I would want to call myself an expert in archaeological theory in this particular meeting, but yeah, let's go with that. So, like Ollie's talk, there are aspects of this which draw on the book chapter from the Archaeological Theory and Dialogue volume, and then I have used some of that to I think show where some of my thinking has changed through a new case study. So I'm thinking about bread stamps today. I'm interested in what relational thought, ontological approaches, and post-humanism do to my analysis of the past, which focuses on late antiquity and Byzantium. What I'm aiming to do here is to set out how relational thinking has changed my research, which focuses on experience moments in late antiquity and early Byzantine concepts, and I'd like to explore the ethics of what I'm doing in discussion. This is a paper that's me feeling my way into a new potential case study. As Ed said in the introduction, I've previously applied similar angles on relational thinking to particular moments in time, to mourning and shrouding, where I was exploring their associated culturally contextual emotions, and to the development of early Christian music alongside specific aspects of doctrine. Here I want to use a relational way of thinking about the world to set up a question which I think emerges out of Byzantine relations, that is, the development and importance of bread stamps. I found, here's some bread stamps. I found so much to think about and with in yesterday's keynotes, and I'd like to start by picking up on the Viveris de Castro quote that Ben started with, although it was early on in Ben's talk, which focused on taking native thought seriously. It's this quotation: "What happens when we take native thought seriously? When the anthropologist's objective ceases to be that of explaining, interpreting, contextualizing, or rationalizing native thought, but instead begins to deploy it, drawing out its consequences, and verifying the effects that it can produce on our own thinking." This approach to the thought of people who are not me, with whom I do not share much common ground, much culture, is fundamental to my approach to the medieval past. In discussion yesterday, Ollie mentioned that he needs theory to disrupt his own assumptions and experience. He needs theory that is at odds with the Western gaze. And I think that that is also what I need. I need theory to be a disrupting force in my work. What I'm doing when I read theory, indigenous or otherwise, is looking for ideas which challenge my own assumptions about what it is to be a person in the world. Not, I hope, so I can layer those concepts that are new to me over the top of the past and call the job done. I don't think that I'm appropriating. I don't think that I'm using indigenous theory as a lens to further my own ends, although that's something I worry about. Rather, I hope to be able to take Byzantine thought seriously and trace some of the threads of those thought patterns through to think about Byzantine material culture differently. So I'm going to begin by setting out what I think relational theory challenges us to do, and then think about how far those challenges can take us in drawing out relations in theory which are specific to the time and place of my academic study, the Byzantine world. So what do ontological and relational thinking do to me? They do lots of things, but two fundamentals which affect my work are that they challenge my assumptions and they bring power into focus. And really, I'm going to talk about the first point rather than the second, although both of these things have changed so much in the process of writing this book, And I'm really looking forward to Rachel's paper shortly, talking about power. Yesterday, Keisha's keynote really highlighted for me the potential of breaking and reforming categories, which I think is parallel to what I mean by challenging assumptions. The way that I came to this was through Latour. So although Zoe Todd's article on ontology as colonialism highlighted just how much work I have to do to unpack the lineage of those concepts, I'm going to continue to use Latour as shorthand for now. The concept of flexible reconfiguring categories is linked, I think, to that of relational assemblages. And I'd argue that a core precept of relational thinking is that everything is relational, that everything is an assemblage at every scale. The Latourian expression of this theory, which I found really helpful, is the concept of the black box. Here is one. The term black boxing, or black box, is one commonly used in the sociology of science, but I came to it through Pandora's Hope. Black boxing is really an extension of Latour's discussion of networks, where he holds that the world is relational at every scale, from social networks and economics to the macro, micro, and even quantum levels. We're able to understand assemblages, such as the assemblage of, which is a molecule, the assemblage which is a carpenter, the assemblage which is the internet, the assemblage of Zoom calls, and perhaps the assemblage which is a conference paper, as entities. We can understand all of these different assemblages as entities because we group or categorize assemblages and define them as things. The process of ignoring the interactions and past actions that make up a thing and only paying attention to its output, what it does in the present, is black boxing, is the creation of categories. At perhaps a meta-ontological level, I think that we could argue that ontologies are black boxes, and that's something that I'm thinking through, particularly through Craig's contributions to the volume. The key insight that I take from Latour is that black boxes can be reopened, renegotiated. They're not fixed or essential, but always reconfiguring. If anything within the network which makes up the black box changes, the black box as one area of the network itself is different. This is a roundabout way to come to the possibly self-evident conclusion that the way we understand things affects what they do, affects our experience of the world. The understanding that our interactions, our relations, are predicated on what I've started to think of as the taken for granteds that cause so much friction when they rub up against each other, when we don't acknowledge that other people's taken for granteds are different. So where does that leave me with my Byzantine material? It leaves me looking for questions which emerge out of Byzantine categories, with partial understanding garnered through reading theory, indigenous and otherwise, which challenges the deeply felt truth of my young self that there was one way to be in the world and it was my own. Down to business then, a very short introduction to Byzantium. Really quick context. The Byzantine Empire lasted from about 400 to about 1400, but it is in itself something of a false category that demands to be reconfigured. Byzantine people thought of themselves as Roman. The term is 18th, 19th century, and the political structures covered the area of the former Eastern Roman Empire centered on Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. Culturally, inevitably, the boundaries of all of that are fluid and nuanced, and vary enormously over the 1,000-year period that we call Byzantium. Key points to note: the Byzantine Empire was majority Greek-speaking and Orthodox Christian, and maybe let's unpack that term of orthodoxy a bit. Sorry, thought I had an orthodox slide. The idea of orthodoxy in both relational terms and in more general parlance is that there's one right way to be and everybody sticks to it. Part of what relational thought does for me is that it challenges orthodoxies with a small o. You would think that this might get me potentially into a sticky spot, as it really isn't my intention to challenge Byzantine orthodoxy capitalized, and maybe it does. But one of my baseline assumptions, one of my taken for granted, is that societies, people, and beliefs are often self-contradictory. They don't have to have perfect internal logic. And the goal is not to project modern orthodoxy on the past, but rather to think with the themes and take it for granted that develop out of the vibrantly heterodox practices which existed between about the 2nd and the 4th centuries AD as something that we kind of retroactively call orthodoxy is forming, is forming. Within my own work, the process of challenging my assumptions tends to start with experience. So I'd like to take a minute to talk about how I see phenomenology and relational thought interacting before finally getting to the bread stamps. Other than in the work of a few individuals, Graham Harman, Bjorn Olsen, the rest of the object-oriented ontology crowd, phenomenology isn't particularly central to conversations about relational approaches at the moment, but it tends to be my starting point. I'm explicitly not talking about the transcendental phenomenology of Edmund Husserl here, which rests on the idea that there are universal qualities of human experience. This, I think, is diametrically opposed to relational thought. The problem with working from a position where minds transcend time and space is that we cannot be certain that people in the past experienced or thought about the things in the same way as we do. In fact, it's highly likely they didn't. It's increasingly obvious that even people who live in the same time and place don't necessarily think in the same way. An example of this is a condition called aphantasia. This is a particular type of cognitive disposition where individuals essentially have no mind's eye, completely lacking or unaware of mental visual imagery. I was reading a newspaper article about this in 2019, and as I was reading, it became eerily familiar. I started to ask questions of friends and family along the lines of, but do you really see things when you imagine them? I think I'm aphantastic. Great word to say out loud, aphantasiac rather. But I was entirely unaware of that until I was reading about it. And I still find it really difficult to believe that my own inner life is so different from the majority of people around me. Until reading about aphantasia, where you have no pictures, no mental imagery, my dreams are not visual, none of my interior life is visual. Until I read about that, whenever other people mentioned seeing images in their minds, I assumed that they were talking metaphorically. I've never been able to conjure up even so much as a colour, so my taken for granted, my baseline assumption was that all other internal human experience reflected my own. With respect to internal visual imagery, I'd essentially internalized a transcendental approach to the human mind. So that strand of phenomenology isn't helpful when we're trying to think relationally, but it is by no means the only strand. Setting aside potentially unhelpful transcendentalism, I think aspects of a more hermeneutic phenomenology are actively useful for a relational approach to the past. I'm talking here about ideas that I've come to through archaeological mobilizers of Heideggerian phenomenology, particularly Chris Gosden and Julian Thomas. I am well aware now that what I really need to do is go and read a lot of different theory, definitely including Hannah Arendt, but so far that hasn't been the way that I've found my way in, and changing my canon is really taking time. And I think that there's a point here that's emerging out of discussion about legitimacy, where our canon is, how we shift that, how we change that. The aspects of Heideggerian thought that I find really useful are the anti-dualist elements. In place of the oppositions of mind and body and person and world, which underlay Husserl's investigations, Heidegger argued that human beings could never be separated from the world in which they lived. The term Dasein captured this inseparability. Dasein is always being in the world. Because Dasein is thrown into the world, there is no essential human prior to specific historical contexts. Humans are always located in the flow of time. Being the world is thus inevitably a historically situated position. In addition to being non-dualist, Heidegger was a rigorously relational thinker, I think, something he has in common with actor network theory and Latour, despite Latour's occasional snarky asides about him. Heidegger emphasizes the need to move from thinking about bounded objects opposed to human subjects towards acknowledging a position where the two are relationally constructed within a shared being in the world. Critically for Heidegger, things rather than objects are gatherings, a term that he develops tracing the etymology of the German Ding. This is a theoretical move shared by Heidegger and Latour. The relational nature of things allows Heidegger to identify two modes in which things are disclosed to Dasein, ready to hand and present at hand. When things are ready to hand, we do not think about using them, whereas when things break or when we don't know how to use them, they're brought into sharper focus and become present at hand. To clarify this, we can imagine 3 stages of riding a bike. I've lost my place. To begin, we have to think closely about the haptic knowledge that goes into learning to balance and propel ourselves forward. A novice bike rider is paying close attention to balance in a road surface, and these thoughts are close to the surface of their consciousness. In Heideggerian terms, their practice is present at hand. As our cyclist gains proficiency, the physical act of riding a bike becomes second nature, and the relations between balance and road, speed, weather, and self are smoothed out, and appear as one single act, cycling. In Heideggerian terms, cycling is now ready to hand. It is embodied knowledge that requires little thought. If part of our bike breaks, the chain slips, the caliper brakes wear down, or we suddenly get a flat tyre, the bike returns to be present at hand. This form of phenomenology, I think, affords me terminology that can be used to describe the nature of human experience as deeply relational and embedded in the world. The collection of different philosophical perspectives that we label phenomenology go far beyond a claim of universal human subjectivity. In its hermeneutic form, stemming from Heidegger's reworking of Husserl's key concepts, it shows us how we can attend to the disclosure of a particular historically specific form of being in the world. These revel in and foreground human experience without denying relations or imposing dualisms. This is what I think Thomas's time, culture and identity did for the British Neolithic, and it's what I'm interested in doing for Byzantium. So if, to my mind, thinking about lived experience is situated in a world of relations, which is where I emerge out of archaeological interpretations of phenomenology, if I think this is super useful for challenging my assumptions of how past people experience the world, why isn't it more widespread? Part of this has to be the Heidegger factor. He was a Nazi. In my own work, I think continuing to cite Heidegger as the sole wellspring for this line of thought is pretty reprehensible mixture of fear and inertia tied up in worries about legitimacy and acceptance within the academy. I mentioned earlier that it's taking time to change my own canon, and I have benefited so much from these conversations in terms of moving my thinking to a more productive place. There are two other elements which have combined to lessen the current impact of phenomenology. The first was the critique put forward by Joanna Brooke that undermined claims that the human body was a source of universal shared experience. Brooke convincingly showed that different bodies of women, of children, so on, have very different experiences. She also argued that bodies too are emergent historical phenomena and so cannot be essentialized. While this critique focused primarily on the phenomenological methodology that Tilly had developed and applied to archaeology, it helped to undermine the broader philosophical claim as well, at least in the eyes of many archaeologists. Second, archaeology as a whole has seen a turn away from accounts that focus primarily on human experience. Variously classed as the material turn or as non-anthropocentric approaches, many current theoretical ideas attempt to decenter human beings from analysis, the very opposite of what much archaeological phenomenology has attempted to do. As such, it's perhaps little surprise that despite its centrality to the emergence of relational approaches in archaeology more widely, fewer archaeologists are explicitly using phenomenological approaches than during earlier waves of relational thought in the discipline. And I don't mean to change that necessarily, but it is my point of connection to a Byzantine relational way of thinking, I think. So back to business. Let's talk about haptic vision. What can I take as a starting point to reposition my understanding of Byzantine objects to work more on Byzantine terms? Here I'm choosing to take one element of being in the world, vision, and try and look at bread stamps using a Byzantine rather than a modern Western gaze. Byzantine vision was haptic, meaning that rather than my own understanding of vision, which is fuzzy at best, the understanding, not the vision, although sometimes that too. So rather than a working knowledge of light reflecting off surfaces, hitting sensors at the back of my eyes, Byzantine sight worked through people's spirit reaching out through the portal of their eyes to touch objects and return to the person with an impression of what they'd seen/felt. This is a very different sort of relation to a modern Western understanding of sight, and because it's a different relation, different meaning emerges from it. Once we take the step and take haptic vision seriously, which is something that I've come to mostly through the work of Visera Pencheva, her volume on the central icon is fundamental in my understanding of this. Once we take haptic vision seriously, all sorts of elements of Byzantine thought and culture and writing make more sense. These range from doctrinal ideas that you shouldn't look at corrupting images and you should avoid accidentally glancing at them because they'll imprint themselves on you in a very tangible act of corruption. So it ranges from that to a better understanding of the iconoclastic controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries AD, when the eyes of icons were scratched out to prevent them having the sort of agency iconoclasts worried would cause people to worship the icon as an idol rather than communicate through it, which was the Orthodox position. This plays out in icon production in a really interesting way. Arguably, there aren't any fakes in Byzantium. When you copy an icon, what you're doing as an icon producer is, yes, you want a visual representation of the icon that's in front of you, these objects that show the faces of saints that are used for worship and intercession. So you're copying this thing, but in doing that, in looking at it, your eyes reach out, they create a print of the object, it imprints on you, and then you in turn use that sort of spiritual imprint to impress a new version of the icon. So two icons could look completely different, but if one is taken directly from the kind of source icon, it cannot be a fake, it cannot be a copy. Instead, it is its essential truth is in that spiritual imprint rather than its physical form, which I think is fascinating. So what about bread stamps? My working hypothesis, and as I said, this is quite a new case study, and it's one that I'm starting to work through, is that bread stamps, which were really common throughout the first millennium AD, moved from being a way of indicating which bread was yours in a communal oven, like this example on the left, a first century example from Pompeii, to being a sort of proto-icon, arguably the one on the right, which is about 6th to 9th century, which has the inscription is Jesus Christ victorious. I think that these stamps move from a way of indicating which bread was yours to being a sort of proto-icon. And this isn't a totally original idea. It's not a hypothesis that's sprung out of relational thinking alone. Stamping bread has been described by the leading Byzantinist in the field, Beatrice Cizot, as an act which transformed loaves into blessing bearers, porteurs de benediction. But what I think relationality helps me to do differently is to think about the why of it. A large part of Byzantine theology revolves around making the absent present. This trait's visible in contentious debates revolving around the embodied nature of Christ and in the eventual iconoclastic controversy of the 8th and 9th centuries AD. The persistent desire to make tangible the intangible is really present in material culture. Stamps were daily objects. And I think the iterative process of stamping bread and consuming it both as sustenance and then also as the Eucharist, although you didn't make that yourself, slides into focus when we think about the haptic nature of vision in a relational way. I want to pull back from stamps a little and go back to and pose a question for discussion among the panelists. I've previously found the concept of flat ontology, the sort of symmetrical approach, a really useful starting point. That idea that we need to start from a position where the importance of agents emerge out of relations, I found very helpful. This is something that I'm starting to rethink, and actually the conversation so far this weekend has really helped with that. My question is whether the concept of a flat ontology is maybe unhelpful. It seems to me now that the idea of starting from a point where the potential of all sorts of agents to act is equal, a sort of neutral baseline from which analysis should begin, is maybe another projection of a Western gaze, which says if you're not using my metaphysics, then you're not using any metaphysics at all. I think one of the reasons that I'm increasingly uncomfortable with really both phases of symmetrical archaeology is the sense I get within those perspectives that if you flatten a Western ontology, you end up with neutrality. And I'd contrast it with a position whereby localized theory of the sort that Keisha so elegantly led us through yesterday is a much more valid place to begin from than either a Western metaphysical gaze or the false sense of security produced by the ideological neutrality of a flat ontology. This is what I hope that I'm doing when I foreground a distinct element of Byzantine experience, such as haptic vision, and use it to explore a particular set of objects, in this case, bread stamps. Thank you. Sorry, I rushed.
Thank you much, Sophie. Perfect. Perfectly timed, very interesting. Yeah. Panelists? Yes, Ben, thank you.
Oh, sorry, Craig, did you want to go? Thank you, Sophie. I love the bread stamps and iconicity, and I think that is that's got lots of legs to it, that particular topic. And I was interested to see you bring up Heidegger, and at the end, your question to us, I suppose, about flat ontology, which I mean, I'm not sure I remember enough, but it does occur to me that there's something that we can connect here with Ollie's talk, in the sense of you know, the critique of the essences approach, as he called it, the symmetrical archaeology as it currently stands, triple O, you know, object-oriented ontology and so forth. And I think, you know, Heidegger, who is a very problematic figure, but there's a couple of ideas from him that I think have been incredibly influential, and you know, I think are still worth thinking about. I mean, he was very influential on Ingold's work, as we know, in kind of what I call Ingold's ontological reversals that he's done throughout his writing career. But the thing is that this notion that there's something that's withdrawn that you bring out in your talk, or that something, and it's, I mean, when we begin to call that essences, perhaps we are doing it a disservice, because it is something that is beyond our immediate relationship with a thing. And I think to hold on to that idea is a very useful thing to do, because we allow ourselves the possibility that things could be very different in our relationship to other things, or even in the notion of what a relationship is. So I think I suppose this is a comment more than a question. I think that was just a very useful thing to bring up, and I'd be interested to hear what other panelists think about your question about flat ontology versus something else. I mean, perhaps what Heidegger does is lend some kind of depth. I mean, the way that it's presented in symmetrical archaeology, I don't know if you agree, it becomes quite mysterious and kind of this foreboding hidden presence and things, which I understand that the rhetoric can be problematic. But I think there's something there too that is definitely worth thinking about in terms of a something that's beyond our immediate grasp. So that was my comment. Thank you, Sophie.
Go for it, Craig.
So yeah, Sophie, I was going to say about flat ontology, just building on what Ben said, you know, I actually see it, and again, this is my situatedness in the world and the indigenous people I talk to and do archaeology with, but I actually don't see it as very disconnected with many indigenous ways of how you navigate the difference between knowledge that's stored up in us and experience. And the idea, and I'm going to give a Deloria quote later in my paper, just to like spoiler alert, where he actually talks about this idea where, you know, the Westerner has this knowledge that just crashes down upon them and they can't understand their experience, right? It tells them how to experience versus letting the experience just sit there and be on its own before you start interpreting it away and explaining it away. So I don't think of those things as juxtaposed, but I did want to just ask you, I really didn't want to say more than that, but I wanted to say, you mentioned tantalizingly looking at ontology as a black box, and so I'm interested to hear more about that. And,
yeah, I'm worried a bit that it leads me into a conversation about meta-ontologies that I don't really feel qualified to have. So I kind of want to know what you think, Craig, about ontologies as a black box. But the way that I've been thinking about hand up already, the way that I think about black boxes is as blocks of understanding, right? As a taxonomy of knowledge, or really a taxonomy of anything at any scale, which makes it perhaps not particularly useful, but as a way of cordoning off a particular set of thoughts. And I wonder if what I am not particularly critically doing when I think about ontologies is creating a meta-ontology whereby it's acceptable to understand different ontologies as separate, and I am black boxing them all off and cordoning them off, and actually maybe and like these are things that I'm really struggling, that I'm really thinking through, that maybe what I've done there is to create this meta-ontology whereby I've said, okay, well, these ontologies exist and they are separate, and I can try and understand one from outside, whereas maybe that's not how these things work.
Yeah, I think I was actually thinking about that when I walked to work this morning, Ben, about the difference between convergent and divergent collaboration. Actually, in reality, those two things don't sit apart from each other, right? They actually mix and match and get churned up as we move through the world and talk to different people and sit shoulder to shoulder with our indigenous colleagues and get dirty in the ground. You know, like all these different forms, they're not separate. They intermesh. So I agree with you. I think that's an interesting point, Sophie, and I think I'll talk about that later.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting conversation in relation to, I mean, for connecting flat ontology to the black box. And coming back to these broader questions, which we're all kind of grappling with, which is how do we look at these sort of localized, specific, grounded theories, and how do we connect them, right? How do they make sense with each other? And I think that, in fact, you know, that kind of flatness might work in some ways when we think about the ways in which these different ontologies do connect in particular ways. So it might give us a tool to think through what are the elements of, you know, a Métis ontology that do relate to other ontologies. Not all of them do. You can't pick it up as a box. You can't, it is not a box, I would argue, at all. And it is in fact maybe a network, right? It is an interwoven sash, and there are threads of that sash which might make sense and connect to these other ontologies, and perhaps the ones that are closest to Métis archaeology have the most connections, the most threads in common, but it doesn't mean that there aren't threads that can exist across space and time. And I think we can think about them not as a meta-ontology, but as a fact that there are these multiplicity of ontologies which are interwoven in different and interesting ways. And I agree with Craig, I don't think we can make convergence and divergence as separate categories because I think they mobilize in different ways. But I appreciate, Ben, you know, you bringing back this idea that convergent can be a move to innocence, right? The sense of like, you know, just absolving non-Indigenous archaeologists of their responsibilities of being non-Indigenous and sort of saying, I'm just taking this up and translating it through my understanding and then publishing about it in particular, putting it out in the world in particular sorts of ways. It can kind of absolve the responsibility of being in good relation. So I actually think there's something really interesting about a flatness in imagining how these ontologies relate to one another.
Yes, Ben.
So this is interesting what you've generated, Sophie. So in terms of the flat ontology, I think the idea of flat ontology is developed to enable comparison in some ways because everything is ontological to the same degree. But back to the divergent and convergent, if I may, and I love your phrase, Keisha, dissolving innocence. Thank you. That's lovely. But I would also make the point to continue to push for a separation for the usefulness that it can do. We're talking pragmatically that if as Craig would like to do, converge the two, then we're perhaps recognizing that both are doing both. I think every encounter has convergent and divergent, but in what I said yesterday, I think my thinking was that convergent, which also can compare and differ. Divergent is a different kind of creature in that it's supposed to get at the fact that some things are not of the same domains or are of the same type of domain and cannot be in some ways compared. So divergent was supposed to kind of keep us kind of on the alert to these instances where it doesn't. Well, we can't converge in the way that we think we can. So again, about the innocence point. But thank you, Sophie.
Yeah, and Ben, that's from Eve Tuck and Kiwen Yang's, they call it settler moves to innocence. And I think that's sort of where I draw from that idea that a lot of the kind of reconciliation work and decolonization work is designed to make settlers feel better, not to actually make change. And so I think this is one of those things we have to be careful with collaboration, is it designed to make the archaeologists feel better, or is it designed to actually change how we do things?
No, that's great. That parallels exactly what Dante Angelo, the Bolivian archaeologist I mentioned yesterday, has said about the guilt, you know, dealing with colonial guilt.
Thank you, Rachel. Yes.
that kind of flatness in thinking about ontologies that you mentioned there, Keisha, if I understood you, it is actually quite parallel to a point we make in the book at one point, where we talk about the need to see these different ontologies as equally real and existing in the world, and being prepared to see them all on that same plane initially. And we talk about how it is that you pick, if such a thing is possible, that you select which theories and ontologies might be more appropriate for your material. And in the world where you're working with Indigenous groups, then the answer to that question should be obvious to you, and that you should be drawing on that. For Ollie and I, working in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age in Europe, my stance has been that what I try to do is to select an ontology that I think does the least harm and the most positive that you can do with it. And so there are ways to kind of thereby think about damaging ontologies that produce negative relationships. So for me, humanism in its classic form and anthropocentrism in its classic form produce these damaging relationships with other peoples and the rest of the world, and therefore I don't find them appropriate. And to think about which other ontologies could do the most good in that situation, I think that's a really useful way forward. To add a little bit to kind of Sophie's original position, for me, adopting that flat ontology when I come to the archaeological material isn't about remaining flat or anything like that. It's about allowing the material to talk to me about what is important, if you like, and to give me that space to think about what that might be. And so if we think about a kind of a Bronze Age world, it's very clear that gender is really important at that time, and that's something that I spend much of my time thinking about and doing. If we go back to kind of Ollie's Neolithic world, it seems that gender is not something that's constantly kind of coming to the fore through the archaeological data, if you like. It seems like a more minor note in what happens in the Neolithic. And so what that's telling you is that the kind of, or what it tells me anyway, is that when I'm working from my flat ontology start point and I'm constructing how I'm going to understand a Bronze Age world, I need to be thinking about gender, and to ignore that would be crazy because it comes through in so many strands of the archaeological evidence. But then it will be inappropriate to take that gender concept from the Bronze Age and impose it onto the Neolithic, where it doesn't come through in the evidence in that same way. So that flat ontology gives me that start point, and then I try to, as best I can, turn to the evidence to help me move out of that start point to think about where I go after that. Those were two slightly random comments.
I think that's very much where I have been in hoping that the kind of points of tension, the points of focus, which for Byzantium has to be religion for objects, certainly objects like bread stamps. So much of there's this great quote about someone not being able to get their hair cut in 4th century. I think it's in Constantinople, but not being able to get their hair cut in the 4th century without talking about the nature of body of Christ. Like it's everywhere. It's like this day-to-day thing. So having that emerge as from a position of a flat ontology, having that emerge as a central element to any analysis, whether or not I think it's secular, has been really important. But in terms of my decision process, I suppose maybe it's not that I'm upset with the flat ontology as a starting point, but I am questioning my ability to allow the correct things to emerge, and maybe that's the wrong term in itself. Maybe there are no correct things to emerge, but in deciding how to move forward from a point of neutrality that I don't actually think I achieve, I'm finding sticky.
So I think this is really interesting, and I think one of the things I think of two things. So one, if a flat ontology looking at the materiality of the past says the material will speak to me, there are two things to me that are missing. One is, who am I? How can I listen? What am I listening to? What am I able to listen to because of my situatedness? And the second is, what is silent, right? Because we work with fragmentary elements of the past. So where are the silences in this flat ontology? The materials can speak to us in particular ways, but we don't have all the materials of the past that speak. And not to say that this isn't a good starting place, but I think we have to, of course, situate, coming back to some of what Ollie was talking about, where are we situated? What are we attuned to listen to? There's things I can listen to from the material in, working with my Métis ancestors that I can't listen to in other places because that's not my situated sort of positionality. And then I also don't always know what's missing. you know, and so we have to account for the silences as well.
Those silences are often very loud silences in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, where you're kind of missing so much and you don't have that kind of indigenous strand that you can add into things. And I think also they're affected. This often feels a very strong problem in kind of Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age Europe, that the specialisms that particular researchers develop then hugely affect what they're attuned to listen to. So I am a metalwork specialist. I see metal in a way that I see, I guess, as a kind of a metaphor there. I see metal in a way that I don't see kind of lithics in the same detail, and I don't see pottery in the same detail. And so that kind of positionality is really important, because it very much affects what comes out in the end. And also when we talk about like the effect of our situatedness, I go to the past, I guess, with goals, and those goals very much affect what comes out in the end. That's something I'm going to talk a little bit about in my paper. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Craig, you had your hand up, right?
Do you want to say something, Craig?
I was just going to say, Keisha, when I think about the flat ontology for me, I mean, I guess I was just assuming that this is the way it is for everyone, but of course, it's not just me in the excavation unit touching stuff or finding stuff. It's the relation, all my relations at that moment, right? And of course, that relates to a tribal government down the street. It relates to the TIPO office with me. It relates to my students. So it has much more than just me and the archaeology. In fact, a vital part of that flat ontology, that I apply, I guess, is the fact that someone might disagree with me, right? They might say, well, what do you know, or don't even look at that. Don't look at that, right? You know, that kind of thing. So, or don't dig anymore, by the way. That's another part, you know. So I think that's, all of that has to be considered, not just the things we dig up.
Yes, Ali, thank you.
I found the move, I'm back. Yeah, I just wonder if it's worth clarifying a couple of things at this point, because I think ontology is a really interesting word because of how it gets deployed differently to mean different kinds of things. So that kind of a flat ontology speaks to me about you kind of the position we start with approaching the past, which is about not presuming the ontological hierarchy of things match the kind of ontological hierarchy where we might start with. Sophie's description of ontologies as these kind of black boxes, or I think Ben and Yvonne might describe that as the string of beads model of ontology somewhere, or something like that, you know, where there are kind of past worlds have their ontologies that exist, that are kind of ways of knowing the world. And what I've always took Ben's point to be is about a particular form of ontological difference that emerges when ontologies, or when worlds collide and things don't make sense. There's a kind of clash and a slip, and they can't be explained in the same terms. And you have to change the language, and particularly change the language of the analyst in order to not impose the analyst's concerns onto the past, or the archaeologist's concern onto the past. And I think part of the confusion in the way ontology has been used in archaeology is the consistent conflation of all of these different uses of the term that don't actually help us have conversations, so that when people can get into big arguments about it, when actually they're kind of using the same term for different things. I don't suggest that any of them are inappropriate or wrong or anything like that. I just think it's worth thinking that we have these different uses of the term ontology, and it's worth thinking about how they relate to each other in that sense.
I expected you to ask me which particular form of relations I was using, Ollie, but asking which particular form of ontologies is, you know, also on brand.
And Sophie, there's some questions in the Q&A window from Danny. I think 2 questions. Can you see them?
Yes. Danny asks, what are your thoughts on how we might avoid the dichotomizing and or categorizing and or generalizing when looking at difference in comparisons? I think...
You know, that was an earlier question. Sorry, I think it's the 2 below, from 1137 and 1138.
Oh, I'm on the wrong time. Did Danny raise her hand just now? When I want to think differently, I've been taught that I have to do differently. I have to physically change my actions and words and my experience and experience that for a while before I can understand differently. What do you physically do differently? I think that's a really good question. So much of my exploration of Byzantine ontology rubs up against my atheism and relationship with faith, and that's something that I explore positionality in the book. In terms of thinking and doing differently, I'm not there with bread stamps yet. For song, which is the case study that I explore in the volume, some of that understanding of difference comes out of my understanding of music and my physical experiences of what it is to be in a space with lots of other people singing something that you've learned in a particular way. And I think the physical doing of things which relate, they're not the same, but they relate to the actions of the people that I'm studying is really important, actually, in thinking my way out of my own assumptions of what is. I don't know if that goes any way to answering that question. I really agree with you, basically. I think that experiencing things differently is part of a way of thinking.
Okay. Thank you, Danny and Sophie. Are there any additional questions from the audience? Would like to share their thoughts, or the panelists? Just Ollie.
If we've got time, and if there's no one else, because I dominated the first hour, I don't want to speak too much, but if there is literally no one else,
yes, we have time.
I've got 756 to work through. But I wanted to go back to something Ben mentioned earlier on that I thought was really interesting, is this point about the withdrawal that Sophie was talking about, and about that point that emerges out of Heidegger and that Harman and O people are really interested in. Because it also touches on what Keisha was raising about what we don't know and we can't engage with and is missing and is absent. And I think an awareness of that absence is really, really important. But it's about how you conceptualize what that absence is. And for me, the kind of making that a kind of mystical essence is not a particularly helpful way of conceptualizing that, because I think it raises issues in terms of its historiography, in terms of its emergence, and sort of all sorts of things. And that probably has perhaps some political issues as well. I mean, I'm obviously going to give a kind of Deleuzean take, which is to Craig's nodding because he knows what I'm going to say, obviously, that this is about the relationship between the virtual and the actual, and that we engage with the actual a lot of the time, but part of it is thinking about the kind of virtual capacities that things have. And in my talk, I was talking about how nobody knows what a body can do, because when you bring it into new relationships, new things come out. And so absences in the past, for example, don't have to stay absent forever. There was a long period of time where animal bones couldn't tell you about when that animal died, and then radiocarbon dating gets invented, and now animal bones can tell us new kinds of things, and the virtual capacity of those bones has shifted and changed. We could actualize them in new ways in our archaeological narratives. So that kind of something that was withdrawn and absent isn't permanently gone. It can be brought into conversation in new kinds of analytical techniques. And in the same way, I'd argue that new theoretical approaches are also ways of drawing out and asking new kinds of questions. Personhood's a really great example of that, where for any issues that might have emerged in the kind of personhood debate, the really powerful effect that the first time I encountered Chris Fowler's work, for example, was in making me suddenly realize that the capacity of human beings to have these very different kinds of identities, the ones I was familiar with, which weren't about individuals, but were relational in all kinds of different kinds of ways. So that shift and that change gives us a sense of how that absence, that withdrawal, what's missing, is again can change and shift as we iteratively work with our data, as we talk with each other, as we learn new theories, as we broaden our conceptions and our horizons, because of the way the virtual and the actual are caught up in a relationship with each other for me. So I find that an easier way to conceptualize it than the kind of mystical withdrawn essence that you get out of Harman's reading of Heidegger in particular.
But it also seems that Harman, as you say, Ollie, I think you're right. I think when Harman writes about these things in the most interesting ways, it's when he goes back to a relational point of view, because he's flexible, right? Whereas I think some symmetrical archaeologists, or again, whatever they choose to call themselves these days, I don't think they have that flex, right? They don't necessarily, they're not interested in knowing the history of those relations or how those virtual capacities transform with new sets of relations. That's my reading on the current sort of landscape of archaeology, at least.
Yes, Ben.
If we've got time and we're on the topic.
5 minutes, yes.
I think a couple of things is from what my vague recollections of Heidegger, the ready at hand and the present at hand distinction that he makes are very much in relationship, maybe like the virtual and the actual, but maybe not. And I think that the point that let's give people names that Björn Olsen and Chris Whitmore and others are doing in their work, which is theoretically sophisticated work. They know all of this material. So however they're presenting it, and we may be not enjoying the way they're presenting it, it may not be helpful in our minds. They still have a point to make, I think, about that we shouldn't be missing, which is about how things can appear to us and can appear to us differently. And then we can't exhaust, in their terms, or in Graham Harman's terms, we can't exhaust the possibilities. So that I think those are very useful things to think about, and to think about the relationship between the absent and the present as a depth relationship as much as some other kind of relationship is also present, is also useful. So I think and the mystery language, I don't mind the mysterious language, the language of mystery, because I think it keeps it kind of, there's some kind of something else going on when we meet things. And I think methodologically also it's useful to keep these things in mind, that our response to things is, is it in response to something that's present at hand, or is it in response to something that's ready at hand? Our theoretical gaze is something that tends to dominate in certain circumstances when there's other things that could be going on. I'm thinking of Thura Petersdottir's work on, which you may not find complete, and it doesn't talk about histories of relationships, perhaps, as Craig says, but it does talk about the encounter between you and things. And I find that very stimulating.
Well, one thing I talked to Sophie about in the book is Karen Barad's use of reading of Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, things like this, and how she writes about phenomena, but she's looking at it in a non-anthropocentric way, which almost cancels out the phenomenological part of it. But there's some interesting passages in there where you can see what she's done with Heidegger and others. Yeah.
I think she disavows Heidegger quite firmly. She doesn't think she's doing Heidegger, but yes.
There's a second part to Danny's question that we should return to. How do I speak differently, and what new relationships have I made that can provide those opportunities for, presumably, for physically doing things differently in order to understand, to gain different ways of knowing. And this is still very much work in progress, but those things emerge in conversation with Greek Orthodox colleagues, with Greek Orthodox friends, and particularly the most exciting route to this for me is in developing conversations with a former master student of mine and her Cypriot grandmother, who uses stamps to bake bread for liturgy and also for personal day-to-day use. And although they're not direct parallels, it's an inherited tradition, right? And I would be grossly negligent if I wasn't developing that side of the work also. So thank you for your question. And yes, there's still lots of work to do there, but it's an essential avenue, I think.
Well, that was a great first session, everyone. I thank you very much. And a lot for me to think about as well, whether it's the meta-ontology or the ontologies of multiple worlds. And perhaps in the second half of the day, we can also take up what Ollie mentioned, how one uses and deploys ontology, that I'm even thinking at times maybe words like ideology and cosmology might even be better suited than the deep-seated dispositions on being and reality. At least that's the way sometimes that I think about that particular problem. But this has really been very, very interesting, and I hope we can bring up Deleuze as well, because despite his hatred of the dialectic and dichotomies, he's pretty dichotomous thinker too, if you think about it, right? Actual, virtual, smooth, striated, territorialized, deterritorialized, those Fun's question about Levi-Strauss's influences. Maybe there are some fundamental ways that we think, despite our ontological positioning or otherwise, whether, even in the thing, Cartesianism has certainly created worlds that have affected us and that we haven't escaped. And we think about relationships and even relationship to things like the commodity, and some of those relations can be pretty sad, right? If we bring up ideas of alienation. I think I'm sounding pretty old-fashioned, right, to try to bring in Marx into this, but with that, hopefully that made you hungry, especially the bread. I felt like eating the bread from Pompeii. It looked still pretty good, So